I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us today to hear about a relatively new initiative, the Joint Roadmap for Open Science/Scholarly Tools. We don't want anyone to be excluded. We have 5 presenters today, 4 with us here on stage and 1 presenting via Skype, so keep your fingers crossed for the technology gods to be in our favor. After I've asked the presenters to each give a brief presentation, around 5 minutes each. We want the majority of the session to be interactive with you. We have a couple of questions that we prepared, but we definitely want to open it up to the floor. So you may want to think while they're presenting, particularly if you have any open source projects or initiatives on campus that might be interesting for folks in the room to hear about, or you may want to ask questions for how they can get involved. We'll be happy to take those. So without further ado, I will hand off to our first presenter. They're going to introduce themselves. Dan Whaley.
Thanks, Heather. So my name is Dan Whaley. I'm the founder of the Hypothesis Project, which I work at with Heather, who's our Director of Partnerships. And Hypothesis is a nonprofit project that builds open source technology to bring a new web standard called web annotations to the web. And we have a particular focus in the scholarly and educational worlds to bring this technology over scholarly material. So I will talk a little bit about an initiative that we started together with many of our friends, many of whom are in this room, called the Joint Roadmap for Open Science Tools. And the basic idea here was I was talking to somebody, and one of the big publishers was thinking about implementing open tools as a way to bring capabilities to their scholarly content, and basically said, don't you guys ever talk to each other, like all you open source, open tool providers? They're offerings from traditional commercial platforms which are totally integrated and look like they were designed by a single group or organization, and they kind of all work together. But if you want to implement the open equivalents, a lot of times they're just a bunch of open projects, some of whom are inside of an organization, some of whom are just projects at a university, or just a guy that happened to write a library that does some function. And they don't behave, and you can't approach them, you can't send an RFP that the projects will answer. So they don't behave in the same way sometimes that other kinds of offerings do. And I think his question was meant to kind of say, have you ever thought, you open people, about doing something in a more kind of an orchestrated way? And that kind of resonated with me, but also had been germinating in the minds of a lot of other people. There have been some projects at Force, the Force 11 workshop and so forth, to begin to start thinking about this open ecosystem. And so a bunch of us got together and decided to bring the projects themselves, the technical projects themselves together, to think about a joint roadmap together, a joint roadmap in terms of technical things, but also in terms of organizational capabilities. So we've done that, and actually we started as the Joint Roadmap for Open Science Tools for a bunch of different reasons. A lot of the projects had a focus in science. Science tends to be a place where a lot of open tooling begins, and the scientific world tends to be a little bit more adept sometimes at implementing these kinds of technologies. But it became rapidly obvious that we should, especially after a workshop that we threw, that we might think about that framing. And so we have officially decided to open it to something scholarly. Scholarly is a kind of a placeholder. There's some folks who think scholarly actually excludes some concepts. So we're still kind of working out what the S should stand for, because we don't want to change our domain name. So we've already picked that. So we're gonna. Well, that's a placeholder, but this is the concept. So So basically, this is the blurb. So far, the major nonprofit science-focused or scholarly-focused open source tools and services have not made a unified effort to come together, compare plans, and create a holistic vision for what the researcher experience of the future could be. So these are the projects which are currently members of this coalition. It's kind of a range of open publishers, repositories, tech stacks, even projects like Mozilla has a project that's kind of Jupyter in the browser, the Jupyter notebook, ORCID, the Wikimedia Wikidata project, which pulls in a lot of scholarly data and information, and which has really become a core component of a lot of open scholarly tools and projects and so forth. So this was current as of like a month or a month and a half ago. I think there's even more folks now. I probably should update this slide. If you have a project which is open in nature, please come talk to us if you think that there might be synergy here. So it's leading kind of open projects in the scholarly space. It was framed initially around nonprofits. We're amending that slightly to be open projects or projects that kind of operate effectively that way. Maybe it's a B Corp or something with protections against acquisition or takeover or something like that. So and the goals are really to start to identify shared user stories and shared themes around how we can begin to integrate and interoperate with each other. So how can this start to look like more of a coordinated ecosystem instead of a pastiche of kind of just random projects? Where are there opportunities to do joint development or align our APIs in order to ultimately provide end users with a more powerful experience? And how can we kind of produce a quote-unquote a roadmap and get started building together? So we've had a series of kind of steering committee meetings over the year, but we also had a 2-day workshop, 3-day workshop actually in Berkeley a couple months ago, where we came together to begin this process. And one of the most interesting things that came out of what has started as kind of a technically product-focused interaction is the opportunity to focus on funding for this infrastructure as well. So one of the sub-projects of this effort that was kind of incubated at this workshop is something we're calling Invest in Open Infrastructure. So this is an effort to organize and deliver funding for open scholarly infrastructure at scale from the most obvious beneficiaries, the global institutions and agencies that form the bulk of academic support and funding today. So this is kind of many of these same folks, but people and organizations specifically within this open orbit, which have been working towards providing or organizing funding for open infrastructure already. So the joint roadmap, this project, which is has several different names here towards the scholarly commons, is something that Mike Roy will talk about a little bit later, but it came out of something many of you have heard of called the 2.5% commitment, which was a paper written by Dave Lewis and Mike Roy about how library budgets inside institutions might think about allocating some top-line funding towards supporting open infrastructure that they can benefit from, and I'm sure Mike will talk a little bit more about that later. SPARC, both SPARC Europe and SPARC US, operas, and then a group of private foundations that provide funding called the Open Research Funders Group, which includes the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, the Sloan Foundation, the Moore Foundation and Gates and a bunch of others. So in a nutshell, what we're trying to do here is solve a problem, and the problem is that it's open infrastructure is increasingly playing a large role in the infrastructure within the scholarly institutions. But the means to fund and sustain that open infrastructure really doesn't exist right now. And so our mission is to essentially solve the problem of how do we create sustainable funding for open infrastructure in the institution. And to put a game plan, a 3-year game plan together to start delivering that funding all the way from identifying the sources to organizing and delivery of it. So we're looking for fully formed end-to-end open community-controlled infrastructure, sufficient funding to support its evolution and operation, and also sufficient funding to seed and incubate new projects within that. So typically that funding has come in kind of a hodgepodge of different places from a fairly few number of private institutional or funders or private foundation funders like the Sloan Foundation, but it's really not sufficient to jumpstart the scale of new projects that are out there and so forth. So here are some next steps that we're working on. We're going to hire some staff and get some funding for that staff, do a survey of projects, outline the potential funding sources, and then really work with those sources to co-design an approach to bring this funding together and establish criteria and develop some governance for that, all targeted at this kind of 36-month time frame. So that is, those are my slides. So I'll move straight to, I think, Lisa, who's next, right?
So hi everyone, I'm Lisa Janicki Hinchliffe at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I think especially when we're seeing so many icons of organizations up there, I'm just me here, not representing the university or the library, but was very pleased when Dan and Heather and some others approached me to be part of this conversation with some of the perspectives that I think I've been bringing to some of the conversations, particularly on the Scholarly Kitchen, but maybe in some of our other spaces, with my personal attention as an information literacy specialist and a person who spends their time thinking about how people through libraries learn to use resources and tools that we provide to them in order to do their work. And so the phrase I feel like I've used a lot is that I am aggressively user-centric in my thinking. And so very much looking at what users do, much more than what they might in the abstract say they believe in, which is an interesting disconnect at many points in time. But particularly centering on this idea of the user and then a user community at a particular institution. So at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, I'm thinking about a very particular user community that is my responsibility to be thinking about their needs in order to achieve the aims that they have and that our institution has. So we're a particular place and space with a particular mission. And so the way we might look at these tools and this roadmap from a very user-centric and community-centric perspective is the degree to which these things serve our goals and our ends. So it's all about us. I mean, from the way I'm thinking about these things. So what do my users do? What are their practices on a regular basis? What are their needs? The needs that they have, that they not just can express, but that we can hear them describe as their pain points, which are often described in ways that are very personal to them, and they do not have the ability to then rephrase those as a product that they want. They know they have a problem. They are counting on other people to come up with solutions. They are also not going to usually spend a whole lot of time seeking out and comparing a lot of solutions. They are typically going to encounter a solution, try it out. If it works well enough, that's what they're going to use. They do sometimes have preferences about different things, and they do sometimes bring belief systems into it, but the primary belief that they bring into it is the importance of their own scholarship and the rewards and pressure systems that they are under. So by and large, much more important to them is going to be, can I get this article published? Can I get my grad students funded, et cetera? And if along the way it happens to be, I mean, honestly, half the time they're using open tools and they don't know it. Half the time they're using commercial tools and they're sure they're not. So this is just not really front and center about how they're looking at their workflow. They look at their workflow around the work I do. Everything else is in service to that. And so really keeping that in my thinking for me is really important, because what I also see is people don't use tools because we tell them they're like inherently good. They use them because they're useful to them. So I think in some ways I feel like after Dan has done this great job of sort of laying out this vision, I'm sort of going to problematize this a little bit. I'm such an academic. I carry the title professor, so I have to bring in the word problematize. You know, like what works is what matters. First and foremost for users, and they are loyal to particular tools until the moment that they are not. And they are immediately disloyal when something stops working. We face this in our own libraries quite like people who can be like the library cheerleaders. Something goes wrong for them and the library is no longer in that workflow. So they are loyal, quite loyal, until they're not. And they also generate their own alternatives. So as Dan pointed out, many of the tools even that we saw on that slide were generated by some scholar saying, I have a problem and I have the ability to maybe create something that helps me solve it. And then eventually other people are using it and suddenly it's not supported, it's not scalable. And that's really not what they mostly went into this business to do. They're trying to do chemistry or whatever, and now suddenly they are supporting a community of users and not what they intended to do. So I think ultimately one of the things that I want to also bring to this is it's, I think, really helpful to think about these tools developing, but what is the relationship then with institutional policy and support around those tools? So certainly if there's a full laid out infrastructure and workflow, then that's something that can be adopted as an institution. But typically institutions are looking to standardize, regularize, and create compliance around things, because that's what helps scale at both financial level as well as policy. It doesn't mean that we don't have 1,000 flowers blooming, but at some level, when we get to these enterprise level systems, we are looking for one enterprise level system. So you are either a PeopleSoft or a Banner university. You do not run both, typically, except for those 6 months when you're transitioning from one to the other. Same thing, we run one library integrated library system. You know, you're either Voyager, eLife, or so we run one of these things at the big level. So one of the questions I personally have when I look at this joint roadmap is, what will it take for this open infrastructure, regardless of how you define it as open source, community driven, like whatever that framing is, can it get big enough and robust enough to really be an enterprise level kind of institutional environment? Or is it always going to be sort of relegated to this sort of like secondary, in addition to an enterprise level system that we might be running, which is probably then a commercial system? Something I've written about of lock-in and those sorts of things. Will it always be sort of the secondary ancillary system, or can it grow to be robust enough where it can indeed be a replacement system? Because it's got to be able to respond to an RFP too, as Dan pointed out. So some thoughts from sort of as a librarian watching this space and these tools develop. And as I said, I'm really focused on my users first and foremost in this, and the ways that they're going to behave, regardless of how I might want them to. Like they really don't care that much about me. So really being focused on them and what they want. So I look forward to hearing our next speakers and hearing more about this. So, Allison?
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to Dan and to Heather for inviting me here to talk a little bit about Coco. Coco, of course, is the Collaborative Knowledge Foundation. And first, I'll just share a few things about myself. So I've been in the industry for about 15 years. I've spent time with commercial publishers as well as with commercial software as a service vendors. And in my spare time, I also volunteer on many industry committees and boards, including working on contributor recognition with the project credit and the ISMTE and CSE and other committees that I'm happy to be a part of. Okay, so now about Coco. So Coco is a non-profit organization which is mission-driven, and the mission is all about being able to transform the way that knowledge is created, produced, and shared. And so Coco was founded in 2015 by Kristen Rattan and Adam Hyde, and within that time, Coco has built up open source tools to solve problems in the areas of books, journals, and rapid publications, such as micropubs. And they've done this through working with use case specialists. So to get to some of Lisa's points, they've really engaged these communities to design and in some cases even build these tools. Okay, so as I mentioned, Coco's working with a number of organizations to do this work. And some of the participants within these communities are on this slide, showing the journals community primarily, although Caltech belongs in that rapid publication space with the Worm-based micropublication database. But so University of California Press and California Digital Library are part of the Coco community in sort of a founding role. But within the XPub community specifically, journals platforms have been developed by eLife and Hindawi, as well as European PubMed Central or EBI. And each of these tools is different. It's built using open source an open source framework called PubSuite, and the components are all modular, meaning that while each of these platforms is different, they can each interoperate easily with other services and tools in the ecosystem or even each other. And so on the book side, this slide is speaking to our Editoria community. And so several of these organizations are in this room. And Editorial, of course, was also founded by California Digital Library and University of California Press. And this year, we've spent a lot of time building community around Editoria. And most recently, in October, we had a community meeting. And what we were doing at the meeting was really starting to activate the community to really own Editoria and start driving the roadmap in terms of submitting proposals for ideal functionality and starting to get developers thinking, for those who are not using a hosted instance, how they would contribute back features to the wider community. And so we're starting to work out governance plans and working towards sustainability with this community. So that's the story so far for books. I do want to point out, also at the community meeting, we delivered some documentation on Editoria. And so this is a book that both Coco, as well as Book Sprints, which is another member of the community, and UCP and CDL all collaborated on in the days before the meeting using Editoria. So we used Editoria to actually write, edit, and then export and print. Well, we use a printer to do that, but everything else happened in the system, and we were able to actually deliver this book overnight to the community meeting. And you will learn more about Editoria tomorrow if you attend a session that the Editoria founders, Catherine Mitchell and Eric Van Ryn, will present tomorrow. So I've talked a lot about sort of community, because that's really Coco's approach in terms of using the community to solve problems and collaborate across organizations that might ordinarily be competitive to one another. However, obviously, there's a huge component that is technology, and so this is just a flavor for some of the technology that Coco has been able to facilitate among the community members. And so what you see on screen here is a project called Wax, and Wax appears in the XPub Journals platform as well as within Editorial. And what Wax is a web-based word processor, which sort of an easy way to describe it is that it's sort of a Google Docs optimized for scholarly communication. And so it's configurable, and as I mentioned, it can be adapted to modularly fit into different platforms like XPub and Editorial, but certainly others too. And so that's really it from me. We at Coco believe that it's all about people, and it's all about working together, and we can all achieve more that way, which is why the joint roadmap is so important to us, and I'm just happy to be here talking with you today. We'd love to learn more about your workflow as well, so as I mentioned, there's a session on Editorial tomorrow, and I'll be there, and yeah, talk soon. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Travis Rich. I'm a member at the MIT Knowledge Futures Group. And the Knowledge Futures Group is an initiative that is joint between the MIT Press and the MIT Media Lab. And it really came out of our internal frustration that so much of the work that we did at the Press and the work we did at the Media Lab was dictated by these proprietary systems that were driving how we could communicate about our work, the timelines we could talk about it, and the sort of interfaces that we were allowed to share what we were doing with the public and with each other. And so from day one, the mission has really been of the Knowledge Futures Group to empower ourselves and other universities, other libraries, other institutions, be they nonprofit or for-profit or whoever, to dictate the means and medium of how they communicate about their work. And so that means everything from open collaborative scholarly tools to data interoperability tools and protocols. And for us, I think there's a driving sort of ethos there that to do that well, to be able to define your medium and means of communication and sharing of your work, to do that well, you need to be able to not start from scratch every time you want to do something new. And to not start from scratch, that means that all the hard things that no one cares about, like export from Microsoft Word or import from EPUB or being able to find the DOI number of this article by title, all that stuff has to be somewhere that is easily accessible and easily integratable. And for us, we draw a lot of models from the way that open source software has worked. And to Dan's point earlier about how they asked, don't you guys talk to each other? The great thing about open source software, and maybe this is because they're all engineers and they're all stereotypical in some ways, that no, we don't talk to each other, right? And that's wonderful because for a lot of our projects to work, we rely on code that the NFL wrote to handle metadata in HTML documents, and code that Airbnb wrote to handle email submission forms, and code that some woman in London named Lucy wrote to help drive the design of different fonts on different browsers. And if I had to go to each of those people and ask them for permission or agree on some common contract of what we were going to do, none of what we did would have started. So the fact that the collaboration is permissionless is important, but I think in order to make that collaboration permissionless, the infrastructure and this joint roadmap really does have to be in place. And so for us, and maybe this is just my inner engineer talking, is that we're doing all this work so we don't have to talk to you people anymore, because at the end of the day, to Lisa's point, like the only thing we care about is what we want to get done. We don't really care about that it's open. We only care about open because it's superior as a model for scaling to complex systems that work in these production environments. And so an idea for the S in the URL is that maybe we could name it the Joint Roadmap for Obviously Superior Tools and Technology. And if what we're doing is not obviously superior, then we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't pick open because it feels nice and warm. We should pick open because it's actually how you scale effectively to this enormously complex problem of how we actually drive things forward. So the Knowledge Futures Group is me and those lovely people. A bunch of them are here at this conference, and if you can find them, you can talk to them. They're amazing, and they're friendly, and they're somehow friendly and incredibly intelligent and capable at the same time. So if you can find them, talk to them for a little bit. They're great. There's a few projects that I'll really quickly talk about at the Knowledge Futures Group at the moment. PubPUB, which is our open source community publishing platform, and it's sort of our vision of what the full pipeline of publishing could look like if all open tools were used. And so everything from drafting to publishing to reviewing to iterations and discussions, all of those things in sort of one turnkey package, so that if you don't want to touch code and you don't really care about open, you just want a solution, you can play with that, and it happens to be fully open, and we can explore that. The Underlay, which for us is a protocol for data interoperability that focuses on not agreeing on a single standard. And so how do you let people have their own standards for how their data looks, and if they happen to be able to talk to each other, they can, but if not, there's clear bridges of how you make that translation happen in the long run. So that's a little bit confusing, but just to say it's a way for data to interoperate without having to agree on something in the beginning. And I'm really realizing we really don't want to talk to people, right? So it's about not having to set up that standard before you start. The thing we found with libraries is that they want to share their data, but they don't want to spend a year changing their database to have this different structured, or changing their export format to have this one little piece. So how do we actually work together in those ecosystems? The bioRxiv is an example that's built on top of the Underlay. It's an application that has Underlay formatted data, so it uses that protocol to provide a top application layer search interface to all prior art data that is offered by industry-led companies that are part of this initiative. It's used by the USPTO in a little bit, some forms right now. We're scaling that up. And I think the thing that we're most excited about for the joint roadmap is Mellon funded us to build an ecosystem map that essentially is a scan of the entire environment of all open source products, what their tools are, what their mission is, how they're funded, how their architecture looks. And that's something that we really hope we can contribute to the joint roadmap, not in a way that says, like, here's what the map looks like, but to say, here's what the data is. So we're hoping that we can be the satellites in the sky taking the pictures of Earth, and then together we can build the actual map interface that lets us explore that and do something interesting with that content. That was funded last June. We think we're going to be getting results early in 2019, and hopefully we'll be cleaning that up and making that available early summer 2019. I don't really want to talk about this slide. Since PubPUB is our most mature sort of project or product that we've been pushing so far, one of the quick notes to say about it is that it's open source both logistically, the code is available, you can take it, but also ideologically, in that a lot of the features that exist in the platform are not things that we necessarily needed on day one, which we thought was all it was going to be, but it's much more about this collaborative, iterative process that has been done with folks like you. And so one of the things that has come out of that is that we realize that the diversity of different fields and the diversity of different processes that exist don't want the same interface, but they do all agree that they want to be able to reveal their process. And so if you happen to do double blind and another group happens to do a review committee of lawyers and then your HR team and then someone else, revealing that process so that it can be understood what happened to a document to get it from the day it was started to the day that you're reading it is the thing that lets you move beyond a brand to say, okay, I don't need to know who published it because I can trust that these 8 people who I know in the field and this version history that I can see and audit is something that I can put enough faith into. And so that map of mapping the collaboration, we have a good idea of what we want to show on that map, but we're also very open to what elements you would need to be able to trust a document without anything else. So if you could show up to a document, audit it in some way, and then decide that you trust the science or you trust the process or you trust the experiment in a way that lets you use that work, what would those details be? And so help us design that map. Help us design what you need to see in order to trust a piece of work as opposed to just brand, as opposed to H-index or citation counts and things like that. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about that at any point in the future. Turn it over to Mike. Thank you, guys.
Let's see if I can successfully get Mike over here on the screen. Mike, you're on screen. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. So
Super.
we're on the title slide. Just let me know when you want me to advance through.
I was thinking, can I make that little beep sound that we used for slide projectors back in the day?
Sure.
That'd be great. So Thanks for having me. I apologize for showing up virtually. I so wish I could be in the room because these are all folks that I'm keen to have conversations with. I guess I'll start. If you can go to the next slide. With just the who slide. So the core group that's working on this project, which we're calling Mapping the Scholarly Communications Infrastructure, is myself. I'm the Dean of the Library at Middlebury College. David Lewis, who wrote this paper that Dan referred to earlier, the 2.5% initiative, which kind of prompted this set of conversations about what are the appropriate levels of investment that libraries and institutions should be making in open infrastructure. And then the third partner is Catherine Skinner, who's the executive director of the Educopia Institute. If you can go to the next slide. The folks that we put together an advisory board. I wasn't successful in grabbing screenshots of all the icons of all the different groups, but the groups that we have representatives from include folks from MLA Commons, OCLC, HathiTrust, Lyrasis, Impact Stories, SCOS, SPARC Europe, ARL, Ithaca SNR, Rework, Library Consulting, James Madison University, the Public Knowledge Project, Simon Fraser University, SPARC, Hypothesis, and JROST, obviously, and the Oberlin Group of Libraries. I suspect he might be in the room, so I'll also mention John Dove, who's an independent consultant that's helping us with us. And part of the intention behind building this advisory group was to make sure that the work that we do connects and is coordinated and aligns with very similar work that's happening elsewhere. So the next slide is really a question of what. And so if you go to, there should be a slide with sheep on it, hopefully.
We're there with you.
Perfect. So the broader project of which I'm going to talk about a very specific set of activities that we're engaged in. The broader project is to participate in what we've been talking about since this panel began, which is rethinking how higher education invests in the creation, publication, dissemination, consumption, and preservation of content towards a system that is, one, more, if not completely open, two, more affordable, recognizing that scholarly communication systems will never be free, and three, takes advantages of the affordances of the digital to rethink what counts as scholarship in the scholarly record. And so that's a very broad goal. What I'm going to talk about today are sort of three very specific things that we're doing, moving towards this broader vision. So if you could go to the next slide, and I should say this is all funded by a Mellon grant, and I definitely want to talk with Travis more because I think we're working on actually very similar projects, and so I'm glad to learn about that. So the first project is what we're calling, if you can go to the next slide, which says Angie's List on it. So this is sort of thinking about what we've been half jokingly called Angie's List for digital scholarship. And so working with our colleagues at JROST, we're conducting a census of all of the infrastructure that one could invest in as part of the broader project to reclaim community control and ownership of the scholarly communication system. So JROST is launching an inventory any moment now. We will launch ours in January. I think the difference between the two is that we are, I should say, sort of reluctantly open to including non-open technology. So JROST is aiming at largely or exclusively looking at open source. We are also recognizing that you can use commercial software to foster the publication of open content. And so that our Angie's List will be a little bit broader, I suspect, than the list that JROST develops. If you go to the next slide, this is what we affectionately call Fitbit for Open. And so the notion here is using the census of technology infrastructure that you could invest in to conduct a survey of institutions of higher education in North America to document how much money, either directly or through investments of staff time, each school is investing in scholarly communication infrastructure. And so this is really David's idea of trying to just keep track of how much money are we actually investing in this. And then, and the reason we're calling it Fitbit for Open is the notion is that by measuring this, one can track progress over time, set goals, in theory, benchmark oneself against one's peers and sort of see how your investments stack up to investments that other libraries and institutions are making. And then if you can go to the next slide, the third product that we're going to be developing out of this grant, and this is the one I definitely want to talk to Travis about, is a map of the scholarly communication system. And so the notion is using the census and the inventory as inputs, creating a visualization of the system of scholarly communication that will show where there are gaps, where there are redundancies, and how investment is spread out across that entire system. And I should say this all, at this stage, largely intending to be descriptive. And so even though David did write, thou shalt give 2.5%, this project is largely just trying to make a map, make this inventory, make this census, try to get some control over what activity and actual work and investment is happening in that space. If you can go to the next slide. If you want to learn more or get involved, there's sort of three specific things you could do or consider doing. So one is we have a mailing list on our website, which is scholarlycommons.net, and you can sign up for the mailing list. And as we start launching the census and these surveys, you will be able to participate in that. A second activity that we will launch shortly is a sort of crowd-funded development of a tool for funding a similar inventory and census for open content. So the larger project that we're engaged in wants to consider not only investments in the infrastructure, but also in the actual publication of content. And then the third activity is starting conversations, which I know many of us are already having on our campuses, if you work at a library or at an individual institution, about your scholarly communication strategy and your collection strategy, and trying to think about which one is budgeted in which way, and are there ways to start moving dollars that you're currently investing in proprietary content towards things that will help sustain this other alternative community-owned, community-governed infrastructure. And so then the last slide is just if you could go to that, that's just my contact information and the website if you want to learn more about it. And that's my story, so I'll turn it over.
Thanks, Mike. So maybe we can have just a quick round of applause for all of our presenters. And I want to point out they did a really good job at sticking to time. And before I kick off with a couple of questions, I want to thank somebody in the audience who's extremely important. The person who went and got a doorstop so that Kim Smalley didn't have to keep opening the door over and over again. So I like that kind of thinking. So thank you. It was making me crazy. So yeah, we just thought in preparation for this panel, we had some conversations on video calls, and we talked about some of the things that we wanted to kind of explore a little bit further. Lisa, one of the things that you mentioned, you knew you were going to be first, right? One of the things that you referred to in passing in your slide, and I know that it's important to you, and it's a topic that I hear about a lot, is the problem of either real or potential vendor lock-in. And when you think about developments in this space, what are your thoughts on that? And anyway, other people can respond as well.
So I think one of the things is how we think about lock-in is kind of important here for what I am sort of, particularly as I look at my user community. So you can think of lock-in, I think, as something that's like a corporate or an organizational strategy that you are pursuing for a user community, and sort of with lock-in as the end goal. Another way of conceptualizing lock-in is the result of value creation. So, I mean, it's not that I don't have an option for where I buy my groceries, but I go buy my groceries at the same place every time because of the value creation experience and the loyalty that builds over time, including that it saves me time because the grocery store is arranged in the same place, and I actually very intentionally don't go to a big box grocery store. I go to a small grocery store. So I'm locked in a certain way by my behaviors, not because I don't have another grocery store in town. So I think that's, when I say the user-centric view of this, that's one of the things that lock-in can happen because literally your campus won't license any other tool for users. But that's interestingly not the kind of lock-in that because in reality, because these tools are open, people can just go off and use them. But which tools are easy to use and which tools sort of sit in a sequence or an iteration of workflow is what is ultimately going to create that lock-in. So if there's any point of disjuncture where there's a gap, if you will, in the open infrastructure, then that is a place that people are going to drop out of that open infrastructure. So there's an interesting sort of, I think, debate to be had because, and I actually don't know if I was tweeting with Allison or one of her colleagues at Coco about this particular issue, which is it sort of antithetical to the notion of open to pursue locking people into open? Like to set up an infrastructure that creates such value that no one would ever want to leave it, right? So, like, does that make us uncomfortable that if I say the phrase, I want to lock people into open, does that make you uncomfortable? And if it does make you uncomfortable, then how is that going to play out? Because there's certainly other people who have no problem locking people into a particular infrastructure. So that's in part what I was trying to raise before about this question of whether open can actually be robust enough, if you will, to be the locked-in system as opposed to the secondary or the alternative to whatever is sort of the institutionally locked-in infrastructure, if that makes any sense at all.
No? Anyone else want to comment on that?
I think, right, I think one of the dangerous things people do about lock-in is they think that as long as you can export the PDF or the XML, then you're free, and that means everything is fine. I think your point is right that you still go to that same grocery store, not because they're the only place that has pasta, but because of all the other features of it, and I think that's important. And I think we see that in that, like, Facebook lets you export your Facebook data, but that doesn't mean that there's a new Facebook overnight now that all that data is there. So just having the data is not sufficient, and I have no idea how to solve that or even like talk about what you do, but the language that makes me feel a little more like we can do something here is talking about diversity of options versus monocultures. And I think the dangerous thing here is that Facebook is the only one of that scale, and so them letting you have your data does not do anything for you. But the grocery store, you might be locked in because of your habits, but it's not dangerous because if they start charging $1,000 for pasta, you're going to go somewhere else. And the fact that there's a diversity of grocery stores is what's important more than the fact that they've tied you to that. And again, that's not a solution at all, but I think that language has helped me feel less anxious about not knowing what to do about that.
Okay. You want to comment on that, Allison?
I'll make one quick comment just because you're both talking about data in regard to lock-in and various gradations of lock-in, but I think also when we're talking about infrastructure, it's also important to think about code and the fact that, like, if you're developing, use case specialists are developing tools within an open source community, you actually can take the code and go in a different direction. So it's not just about the data, it's actually that you can take infrastructure with you too.
My next question is for Allison. So when now at my first open source company, when I talk to people about open source, I sometimes feel that there's an impression that open source is like a lot of work, or that you have to have like a large technical team. So when you're out talking to folks about some of the offerings that Coco has, or talking to different partners, a lot of the partners up on the screen, I know they have really robust technical infrastructures. I mean, how do you respond to that? Like, I don't have, maybe the time or the resources to consider open source.
Yeah, we hear that often out talking, is that folks think it seems like there's a misconception that you do need robust technical resources or deep pockets in order to adopt open source. And I think one of the ways that I respond is to say, it's not always the case, because obviously working within a community, you get to pool resources. and everybody can sort of leverage the work that's been done, say, before they joined, or the resources of others. That's just another way to put it. But also specific to Coco, there's the capability to come in and use hosted versions of the tools rather than requiring that an organization install one of the platforms themselves or develop it themselves. There is the ability to access via a hosted model as well.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just say that I think there's often a misconception between the word open source or the term open source and the term commercial. It also gets conflated with nonprofit and commercial as well. And they're really completely orthogonal concepts. There are organizations that produce open source code and are commercial. They may be nonprofit, but they're also commercially oriented. They're there to serve you if you need a service, and the organization can deliver that, and they have staff to provide that equivalent to a more of a traditional for-profit organization. Open source just means the code is open, and if they go away, you can take it and do whatever you want with it. And it has certain characteristics that give it certain properties that some people feel are desirable.
Okay, do we have questions in the audience? And I'm going to steal one of these microphones and come down and play Microphone Girl, because it's one of my favorite activities. Try not to fall off the stage, though.
Thanks. Is it on? Excuse me. Okay. Well, first of all, I'm a huge supporter of this idea of this open infrastructure, right? But one of my concerns is that, we're making great progress to establishing this open infrastructure, and there's this image or concept that we can be done doing that, right? That we will get there, and now there will be this open infrastructure. And I want to point out that that's actually a mirage, right? Because all the pieces that you're putting together in that open infrastructure are constantly evolving, and new things are constantly coming into the ecosystem all the time. So this open infrastructure isn't a thing. It needs to address that, very, very dynamic situation. So I'm interested in your comments on that. Pardon me? Oh, Bill Kasdorf. I'm a consultant at Kasdorf and Associates.
Just take it out of the...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point. It's not a end state. It's just a work pattern and an aspiration. And I think part of it has to do with the context in which we're working in with institutions and researchers and so forth that are producing knowledge products which are very open in nature. They cite others. There's a kind of a network of knowledge and work which is being created. And so there's a value in the tooling being open in the same way that the knowledge is in a sense open. There are benefits to working this way in terms of opening APIs and building systems that collaborate with each other. You're right in that it's something that we will kind of continue to work for. The price of democracy is eternal vigilance. It's kind of the same thing here. Our goal is to achieve the benefits that we get by working in more open way, but we have to continue in that direction.
We have another question?
Can I jump in a little bit?
Go ahead, Mike.
So it's a great point. There's an article in Aeon magazine a few months ago called "All Hail the Maintainers," which I'm not sure if anybody read, but it's basically making that exact point about the fact that all of this infrastructure, both physical and electronic, requires maintenance, and that people historically do not understand what those costs are and do not invest appropriately in the mundane but critical activity of maintenance. One of the reasons that our project is working, is really glad to have Catherine Skinner involved at Educopia, is that she thinks a lot about kind of organizational health, and these organizations that are trying to build and maintain and sustain and grow these products need to think about all of the costs, and the cost that almost always is underestimated is the cost of maintenance and simply keeping the things running as the underlying technology evolves.
I just want to make one other quick point, is that it maybe is going without saying in this group, which is why it didn't get said, but the very nature of this ecosystem that you're building is optimized for doing just what I suggested needs to be done, right? Because it's open source software and because it's broadly collaborative, that's actually, that architecture itself helps ensure that it will stay adaptable.
Other questions? I have a question for Mike. What kind of response are you getting from libraries to the paper that you did together with David? You know, is there some initial thoughts you can share?
So we did a experiment last fall where we went through the same process without just using basically Google spreadsheets and no rigor whatsoever, just to kind of do a dry run. And we got lots and lots of interest. We had about maybe 60 people sign up to go through the survey, and maybe 40 actually completed it. But there does seem to be, as we've talked, and we did a presentation at CNI last fall, and had, the room was packed. And so there does seem to me this moment, a sort of crisis around everybody's materials budget has gotten to a point that where even the most wealthy of schools realize that the system that we're sustaining through our Elsevier subscriptions, it's not sustainable, and that we need to find an alternative path. So I'd say there's a fair amount of energy around this, even though people are not clear where they're going to find the money, because of the fact collections budgets in particular are really tapped out. So there's interest, but I think that it isn't the case that people immediately said, oh, of course, and started investing 5% of their budget into open infrastructure, because the money isn't there. And that's really the challenge, is how do we orchestrate that shift away from one area of investment to another area of investment, which is why I think Dan's work thinking about how is this funded through multiple streams is exactly right, that it can't fall completely on the library or in institutions of higher education, that there needs to be other investment streams also identified.
Great. And Mike, I realize you can't see the room here. We're in a really big room, and we've had some ins and outs, but we've got about 40 people sticking with us, so I think it's a good indication of interest. Other questions? I always have more questions. So this one's for Travis. So I know you started working on some of these projects when you were still a graduate student. To what degree do you involve, other stakeholders on campus, students, faculty, grad students? What's the reception of the project there?
It's tough, right? And I think this is part of it. Gets back to the not wanting to talk to each other problem, which is both a problem and a feature. But at the moment, the Knowledge Futures group, I think, has done a really good job of involving the press and the media lab. MIT is split up between academic departments and research departments, and so you might be getting your degree in an academic department, but doing research and doing your lab work somewhere totally different. And that system works really well. But I think there's this third tier that could exist of people who are the word deploy gets thrown around a lot at MIT, and I don't know if that's the right word, but the idea of groups that are deploying products, groups that are doing research, and groups that are doing academics. And I think that the interaction between those three and finding the way that the deploy team can keep the research relevant, the research team can keep the deploy team interesting and forward-looking, the students can keep everyone realizing how uneducated they actually are compared to 17-year-olds nowadays. I think that keeps the system healthy. And so as much as we can, we're trying to make Knowledge Futures Group something that has all of those components. And so the press is sort of the deploy arm. They know how to publish and put out content. The Media Lab is the research arm, and we're trying to hire faculty that can take grad students and take that kind of work. And so I think that's key. And I think being a place where other groups who aren't affiliated with the university could come and get those features of being able to work closely with grad students, being able to work closely with academic programs would be a boon to a lot of the effort of having the university be a place where this stuff happens. I have a question if that's allowed. Oh, no, let's go to that.
David, all the way in the back. Oh, not David.
Hi, I'm Jameson Miller. I'm a doctoral student at the College of William and Mary, and I also work at Lumen Learning, which is a courseware provider for OER. I wanted to ask you about, given your comments here about the need for diverse funding streams, how important or what is the significance of this being a not-for-profit approach?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Earlier on, you were talking about that you're all from not-for-profits, and that that was an important part of your open infrastructure. So if this is going to be open, and some of you had experience with software as a service kind of organization, if it is going to be open, are you concerned about for-profits coming into this, or is that an important part of your approach?
Yeah, good. Okay, great question. And I'll just speak for myself. We're not concerned. I think this came from a place of, number one, and there was actually an event that was thrown in Berlin right before Force about a year and a half ago, actually by Coko and Hypothesis, where we brought a whole bunch of projects together that were all fundamentally nonprofits. They were kind of little small projects like ourselves that worked on open source code, and we're kind of doing it in this kind of mission-aligned nonprofit way. And the synergy that was there between the projects and the kind of esprit de corps was so kind of palpable and different than what it has like to experience working with other people. There's a willingness to share and engage because that just doesn't exist in other places. And so for me, in terms of putting this group together, we wanted to take advantage of that kind of energy that comes together when you bring mission-aligned projects together. Initially, it was purely nonprofit, and then people made a very strong argument that there are some other organizations that are kind of on the edges of that definition that share the same principles and ought to be included. And our goal is, and then other people say, why are you excluding us? We're good people too. And our goal is not to exclude everybody else. It's just to take advantage of that kind of crucible of energy that comes together, and people and groups that truly do put their energy into really being open. And I'll just say from my own experience, I'm a reformed technologist in that I used to be I started the very first travel company on the web in 1994, took it public. If you book travel reservations on the web now, good chance that they go through code and systems that we put together. The company was bought by Sabre and forms the basis of their kind of web front end for many airlines and online travel companies. And 600 people and huge. We took it public, and when we were in our strategic sessions as a for-profit, venture funded, our whole language was around stickiness, around switching cost, around how we could keep people on our platform versus going somewhere else. And the taking investment in this way forces you often into this kind of thinking, because you have to produce an exit for your investors, their LPs. They have a 7-year ROI and kind of outcome. And I think for us, pulling these groups together was really about trying to find some screening mechanism to identify people that were going to think differently about how to build technology for the future. And it's a crude filter, but it's reasonably effective, I think.
I think if I can just add to that, one of the things that I think is a real challenge for this group, is when you joint roadmap for open scholarly science, obviously superior tools, it is not actually obvious from that name that you're talking about privileging open source code-based projects, because we have the term out in the world open science, which does not, there's at least a community of people that believe you can do open science with closed tools, right? Like that it's the results of the science that's the open part. So I think this is one of the things that as I've sort of watched the JROS community sort of grapple with this, in some ways you're trying to coalesce around, okay, where are we going to sort of sit in this word open, and what does open actually modify? Is it the tool? Is it the kind of scholarship? Is it both and or sorts of things? So I suspect in part what we're hearing here is sort of a community of people saying, okay, we feel like we're a community, we know we're a community, but now we have to tell other people how we're a community, and so then you have to move from that gut sense that we're alike into definitions, which then do start to sort of challenge you of like, well, it's not just that they're open source, it's not just that the code, yeah, like it's more, and yet those are things that are hard to put into words.
I have another question.
Travis had a question.
Oh, go ahead, Travis. Then I've got a question for Mike, so be on alert, Mike.
I got to remember my question. Yeah. Oh, okay. So it was one thought that came up as I realized we were all making roadmaps. We have the open ecosystem. Mike has the environment scan that they're doing, and the first thought that went through my head was like, well, we can't even get a single roadmap at the joint roadmap for scholarly communications meeting. This isn't going to work. But then my second thought was that right, the map is not the terrain, and even in any given map tool, whether you look at the topography data or whether you look at the road data or whether you look at the traffic data, you need different sampling across different things. And so one of the thoughts that came to mind was articulating each of the sort of ecosystem scans that we're doing as one of those data collection pieces, right? And so I think one thing I was saying earlier to you is that I think it's important that when we deliver these things, we deliver both the visual of it and the underlying data of it. So we both show the topology and a nice visualization of that, but we also give you the raw data so that when you want to make your bike path map, you can use that data in service of this other thing. And I think one of the ways that we have this joint roadmap is by being not prescriptive about what it's going to look like, but prescriptive about what the data we have to build that thing is. That's not a question. But so thoughts on okay, so the question that comes out of that then is, are there specific layers of data? Are there clear subsets like the road data and the satellite data and the terrain data that you see in this, and what are those layers?
Yeah, great point, question. First, I want to acknowledge that there's a group, Bianca Kramer and Jerome Bozeman, that have worked to put, they've done their own kind of ecosystem scan and so forth. And what I see these different scanning exercises being essentially experiments to take a slightly different look at the projects that are out there, and that over time together we'll come up with a sense of kind of how to do this, because it's complicated. There's organizations, there's the software platforms themselves, which are sometimes have a one-to-one relationship with projects, sometimes not. So there's the technical nature of whether they're open source or whether they are focused on science, or what their purpose is, or where their code base is. Then there's the organization. So we wanted to know more about the funding nature of the organizations behind them. Were they nonprofit? Did they have a sustainability model? How were they funded? Were they likely to be around in a few years? How much money did they need that was unmet in order for them to kind of get to where they needed to go, so that we could say, hey, if these projects are so important to how science might be conducted, and there's tons of money out there on planet Earth. If we only had this much money, we could solve this much of a problem. So we were trying to kind of get a financial profile. So that might be your, street layer or whatever. So that's not a complete answer.
I think that there's a project in Europe called SOS, which
That
is
was the
spun out
question I
of-
had for you, Mike. Go, you're perfect. You're channeling me. That was the question I had for you, was to tell us more about SCOS, because you had it in your slide.
So it's it speaks to what Dan was just talking about. So it's basically a mechanism for looking at important critical pieces of infrastructure that are at risk of failing due to lack of funding. And so they've created a mechanism to understand all the different projects and different providers, and then invite them to petition to be included in a campaign. And then through some magical process, they decide which ones are most important, and then direct institutions to direct their funding to those which are identified as most at risk and most critical. And so there's obviously all kinds of hard decisions and who gets to decide who gets the money and what's critical, and to what extent would these sorts of systems end up being gamed by folks, and to what extent are people going to be willing to say that they're really at risk. But anyway, it's a really interesting model. And so we're also in conversation with them to sort of see how this kind of Angie's List idea that we're thinking about can be a guide to making investments where they're most needed and where they're most going to help.
We're almost out of time, but we probably could take one more question if someone had it. Or if I know there's a lot of presses in the room who have projects. If any of you want to put in a sort of not a plug, but why you think it's important to maybe move into the open source space. I'm not going to force any of you, but. Okay, everyone's digesting their lunch. So another round of applause for our speakers. And the technical support engineer, Chet, who's not here in the room, did an amazing job swapping out the laptop because the one in here did not have a camera and a microphone. So if you see the technical support guys, tell them they did a great job. So have a wonderful afternoon.